And let me say welcome and thank you. My name is Stephen Fetter. I manage the United in Learning program for the General Counsel Office, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here for these Thursday afternoon webinars as we try to connect colleagues from across the country and looking at specific skills that are useful and important to us as we try to navigate these waters of the pandemic that have changed so many different things about what it means to be church. It's, I think, a time when we need to gather as colleagues and think through our job and what we do and how we help people and how the ground is shifting under us and trying and how we can continue to offer the kinds of ministry that we need to offer in ways that will bring hope and joy and comfort and relief to people. So today for our program, we want to talk about funerals and grief. I don't know whether that's very attractive to a lot of the people in our pews, but it's certainly something that I think about a lot as a person in active ministry. How do I do that? How do I make sure that I am being the best minister I can be to people who are at a real crisis point in their life? And how does this pandemic change that for us? How does it change the conditions in which we're working? How does it change the needs of the people who are in front of us? How can we offer ministry in this complicated time? So that's the goal of our time together today. We're hoping that it will be interactive and that you will bring your own experience and thoughts and ideas and questions into the conversation. We've brought in a few people with different kinds of expertise to help spark the conversation and prime the pump, but we really are going to depend as much on you and your thoughts as we do on them. I think before we actually jump into this, we should open with prayer. When I'm doing my online worship services, I always light this candle. It's a reminder to me and to many of us that we gather not simply as people doing business together, but we gather as colleagues doing business. And so I think it's appropriate to take a moment to pause and to invite God to be a part of our conversation today. If you've got a candle in your office too, I invite you to light it as well. We gather in the light of Christ. We gather trusting that the work that we do is not done solely on our own strength. We are God's people, and it is the divine that lights our path and inspires the work that we are called to be part of. So in that spirit and in that knowledge, let's gather. Couple of technical things I wanted to say before I introduce our guests today. Had some question from a couple of people last week saying the chat was flying by so quickly that it was really hard to read the chat and also listen to the presenters. And is there anything we can do about that? And I wanted to be reassuring. The chat really is your way to talk to us. But we're not assuming that anyone, even Brett and Susan and Bill, are going to be able to read it and assimilate it all and connect with what they're saying at the same time. And you should know that the people who are watching on YouTube or who are part of the recording won't read the chat anyway because it's not available to them. So the chat really is your way to inject some thoughts into it, and I will spend some time watching the chat and trying to assimilate your comments as we go along. But if you can't do that, don't worry and don't panic and don't feel like you're missing out. It's my job to pull out the stuff from the chat that is most relevant to all of us and then inject that into the conversation or throw it to one of our guests. So use the chat as a way to communicate with me and don't feel under any pressure to read what anybody else is saying unless you've got the time and energy and really want to. It's there as a tool, but it isn't essential for you. Let me introduce the guests that we have today. And maybe I'll actually invite you to introduce yourselves. And I'm just going to ask the folks who are not one of our guests to turn the cameras off so that it's not distracting for people. First of all, let me turn to Susan, who is on my on my left on my screen. Susan, tell us about yourself and who are you and what do you do?
I'm in ministry at Grace United Church in Barrie, and I've done that for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I was in London, where I split my time between a pastoral charge doing ministry and an outreach ministry called Aluco, which was in the inner city, in the east end of the city. So that's my background. Currently, I'm also active in the Ecological and Social Justice Commission for Shining Waters region.
Great, thank you, and thanks for being part of this. Bill, if you could introduce yourself, who are you?
Hello, my name is Dr. Bill Webster. I am a grief counselor. I've been a facilitator of community grief support programs in many places for the last 35 years. My work was actually grounded in a personal loss when my wife died suddenly and unexpectedly in the 1980s. And it was out of a feeling that people meant well and were sincere, but really didn't get it, really didn't understand what I was going through. And of course, in a situation of crisis, you assume everybody else is right and you're the one that's wrong. So
Of course.
I actually thought I was going crazy and losing it. And so it was out of that experience that I went back to the University of Toronto and did my doctoral work. And part of that was in beginning to facilitate a local community grief support program through a funeral home. And the program that I developed has kind of expanded. I've been able to utilize it across the country in Canada and also in the UK. And I've authored a few books and done some videos and these kinds of things. So it certainly has been a very interesting few months, because I think, as I'll say hopefully later on, that the biggest mistake we make is thinking that death is the only loss that causes grief. Because many people have lost many things. So I hope we can talk a little bit about loss and the need that we have to grieve those losses and to express what we're going through.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for being a part of this. Brett, tell us about yourself and what brings you into this.
Well, I'm the president of the Funeral Service Association of Canada. I manage a funeral home in Calgary, and of course our organization is the National Funeral Association, so I represent funeral homes across the country. I started in this profession in high school. As I said earlier on, both my grandfathers had been involved in the local funeral homes, so I got experience at a young age, and I did a little bit in high school part-time. And when I had to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up, I thought this was a great opportunity to give back to people, and I came to Calgary because that's where the opportunity was at that time, and I've been here ever since. I've been here since the early 90s.
Great, thank you. Thank you to each of you for being here. Before we jump into our work, frequently, almost all the time on these webinars, we take a little bit of time right at the beginning to acknowledge the Aboriginal territories on which we're sitting. It's important, I think, to remember that people have lived on this land and nourished it and been nourished by it for thousands and thousands of years. So take a moment and just add to the chat where you're sitting today and which territory you're in. I made the mistake a couple of weeks ago of trying to pronounce all of these names, and then I felt terrible because I knew I was going to butcher them. So with apologies to those who are not able to read the chat, let me just say that we are covering a remarkable variety of territories and treaties. it is always moving to recognize this and to remember that so many different cultures and traditions and families and groupings have nourished this land and been nourished by it. Thank you for that. Somebody else sent me a private note just saying, could they see all four of us at the same time instead of just one? And the answer is yes, sure. So move your mouse over top of the Zoom window, and up in the top right corner, you'll see an icon appears that allows you to toggle back and forth between what they call speaker view and gallery view. If you put it on gallery view, then you'll see us looking like the Brady Bunch. And that might be the better one for this program, because we're going to be conversing back and forth, and there aren't PowerPoint slides to share in today's program. Let me start with you, Brett, because I think you can give us a sense of the lay of the land a little bit, and help us understand how the pandemic is changing things. Most of us on the line are clergy. Most of us have done lots of funerals in ordinary time, but things are different now. What's changing for you? What are you noticing?
Probably the biggest challenge is the restrictions that are posed by each province and municipalities when it comes to gatherings. It's all over the place across the country. Some are recommending no gatherings at all, but the average seems to be around 10 or 15. But again, it really varies from province to province. So as you can imagine, and I'm sure you're all aware, it wouldn't be any different with you trying to have services at church. You're limited on how many people can be in the building at once, and that's probably our biggest challenge. One of our other challenges, which really wouldn't impact clergy at all, but it's been trying to secure personal protective equipment. One of the areas that is going to be has been a big challenge for us is when it comes to graveside services, and you have casket bearers that need to carry the casket to the gravesite. They're clearly within that 6-foot allotment. So trying to secure personal protective equipment for those individuals to ensure that we're meeting the guidelines of that jurisdiction has been a real challenge.
Yeah, I bet it has. I bet it has. I'm wondering how this changes the kinds of services you're able to offer. Are people still doing funerals, or are they just putting them off?
It kind of depends, I guess. My experience with my funeral home, I'm finding most people here are preferring to delay it until they can actually have a gathering that's more than what's allowed right now in Alberta, which is 15. For example, Ontario, I believe, is only 5. So it's very difficult to have a gathering, particularly if you have a family that exceeds 5. So I guess it really depends on where you are. Our sister location on the other side of the city, their families are still wanting to have funerals, even that they're only permitted to have 15 at a time. So kind of depends on where you are, I guess. But there are other alternatives. We've encouraged live online services kind of in this similar format to what we're doing here today, even recording the service so that families can watch it at a later point, or friends or family who maybe weren't able to attend, they can watch it at their leisure. There's lots of different options. The biggest piece of advice that I can give today is contact your local funeral service provider. They'll be up to date on all the rules and regulations in your area. They'll also be able to fill you in on what options they are able to provide, because it's not necessarily going to be the same across the country. For example, I might not be able to offer the same thing that could be offered in Edmonton, or vice versa. So there's a lot of challenges in that regard as to what's available in different areas of the country.
One of the things I found really helpful at your website was that you've listed all links to all of the different provincial regulations. So let me just tell folks that on the recording page for today's webinar, I'll put a link to that page at the Funeral Services Association of Canada website, so that you can go and check it for yourself. But I think it's important to know how quickly the rules are changing. A couple of people in the chat are saying Ontario, it's 10 right now. Newfoundland just went from 5 to 10 today. Somebody else is saying 10 for funerals, but 5 otherwise. It's the rules. we can't know from day to day or week to week what the rules are. So I think it's important to stay up to date.
Yeah, it changes really quickly. We host a meeting every week with the provincial associations. Each province in Canada has a funeral service association, and we've got these individuals together every week to discuss some of the problems that we're all facing and how we can maybe work through those. People have had success in other areas, so we want to share that to see, if that's something that can be used across the country. And the various conversations are about, the challenges with the gatherings and how it's changing. A lot of provinces are starting to relax those a little bit, so it's making it a little bit easier. But I know, for example, Quebec, we're not recommending any gatherings at all. And I don't know if that's changed. I missed the meeting today, but it really varies from province to province, and even cities and municipalities have regulations that might override what the province is regulating. So it's a real challenge.
So a couple of people are asking in the chat, who polices it? I mean, if there are 17 instead of 15, who would know and what's going to happen?
Well, a lot of it comes down to when we plan things with a family. We try to ensure that they understand the regulations, and usually it's by invite only. And then we encourage them to do like an online service, that type of thing. So those that aren't able to be there physically can still attend. Now, like for example, here in Calgary, we're only permitted to have 15 people in the room. That doesn't mean the building, that just means the room. So for example, we assume that it'd be probably one funeral director, because we can easily handle 15 people with one funeral director. So that limits it now to 16 individuals that can attend. Some of the other things that we've done is to have multiple gatherings. So for example, we'll have a group gather in the morning for an hour or two, and then we have another group gather at midday, and then another group gather later in the afternoon. So you have 3 groups of 15. That, however, can be a challenge depending on the funeral home, because they could have multiple funerals, and that's just maybe not feasible. It might be something that could be done in the church. That would be something that I would really recommend the clergy discuss with the funeral director, try and work out all of those details.
And so if you're doing live streamed stuff, which lots of us are experimenting with for Sunday morning things too, what do you do about things like copyright music? Do you have licenses in the funeral homes, or would we need to do it from our churches so we could use our church license? How does that work?
Yeah, most funeral homes in the country have a SOCAN license, so they can run the music. The challenge has been with Facebook Live. They're actually blocking out the music because it's not copyrighted to be played on Facebook Live. So that's been a bit of a challenge, and there's not an easy answer to fix that either, unfortunately. The one thing I thought about today, and I don't know whether it works or not because I haven't tried it, but is if you record the funeral and then play the recording, whether that would affect it or not, because it's not a live service, it's a recorded service. So that's something that maybe needs to be checked into, but we just don't have an easy answer for that one, unfortunately, when it comes to the music. If you have live music, somebody doing a solo, hymns, that type of thing, then that wouldn't be a problem. It's the recorded pieces that are a bit of an issue.
So I mean, we've certainly been hitting similar kinds of issues in our churches too, and it's possible to buy podcasting licenses, but it's hard to let the robots know that you're actually covered by one of those. And so I gather Facebook is even more draconian than YouTube Live is, and they will mute it even if you've got a license to play it.
Yeah.
So it's an issue, but we can. Most of our churches, well, all of our churches now, I hope, that are live streaming services are using a CCLI or a one license, podcasting license. Certainly in my congregation, we get the copyright hits, but then we can challenge them because we've got the license. And YouTube at least doesn't mute us, which is helpful.
Yeah.
What about if the family wants to see the body? Is it safe to be in a same room with the body of somebody who's died of COVID?
Yeah, there hasn't been any evidence that it isn't. We haven't really changed our procedure when it comes to handling remains. As funeral directors, we've always assumed that everybody is potentially infectious. because we don't know what that person died of or what they might have had contact with prior to death. And now with COVID, it hasn't really changed. We just assume everybody's infected. We're thorough with the disinfection process and so on. We've had families view their loved one here that were tested positive for COVID. So we take all the necessary precautions to ensure that those remains are safe for the loved one to handle and view the remains. So hasn't been an issue.
I think that's great because it can be so helpful as a kind of time of closure for people to see their loved one actually dead. It's important. So
yeah, we encourage it as often as possible. Even with cremation, because I run a crematorium here as well, we've had families request to attend the cremation ceremony just because they can't have a funeral. They just feel like they need to do something. So we do allow that where they can be present when we start the cremation.
What do you do about things like flowers and mementos and pictures and pens for the guest book and all of that kind of thing?
Well, guest book, we're not actually doing that just because people are obviously handing a pen back and forth and there's a lot of contact there. So we've kind of put a stop to that. We encourage people to leave condolences online through the funeral home's website or other means. A lot of families will set up a Facebook page in memory of their loved one, and that's a great opportunity to leave a condolence. So any kind of paper type materials we're trying to avoid at this point until we're told it's safe to do so otherwise. We encourage people to buy flowers. A lot of our vendors that we would normally use, like our caterers, our flower shops, those folks are really struggling right now because their businesses have been shut down to the public. So we try to keep them alive by encouraging families or friends to buy flowers, send them to the family. It's a great opportunity to show support and love to that family. Even send them food. You can send out packages of meals, that type of thing, have it delivered to the family's house. These are all different things that can be done. I've seen a lot of the unique things when it comes to the service. Of course, you have a chapel that's empty. I've heard where they encourage on the obituary to have friends send in condolences, and the funeral home will print them out and then roll them up and put a nice ribbon on them, and then put a balloon with a helium balloon so it's suspended in air, and put it in the pews so it looks like people are present. And then the family can go around and open up each one of the messages and read the condolence from that individual. We've also placed roses on the seat of all those individuals that aren't there. We encourage families to send small baskets or even just a single rose to the funeral to place on all the individual seats, because obviously you've got a big empty chapel or a big empty church. That's a great opportunity to show that people are there in spirit, not necessarily in body, but they can still show their condolences. So there's a lot of creative things that can be done out there. I really encourage the funeral director and the clergy to work together. There's lots of great things that can be done. And every day I hear something else that's really unique and interesting and a fantastic idea that can be utilized.
That's so helpful. We need this kind of creativity, and I'm just wondering, with those of you on the chat, if you've seen other things too that you want to share. I think funerals are about more than words, right? They're about symbols and finding the symbols that allow us to carry the grief is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about those pallbearers? You said you put them in protective equipment. Do they really need that, or would gloves and a mask be enough? What are the regulations in Alberta, and what will you need to do? It doesn't feel very dignified somehow.
Yeah, I probably should have been a little clearer on that. Yeah, it's gloves and a mask, particularly a mask. Gloves we can kind of get away from, but masks in particular, because this is an airborne virus, they want to ensure that they're protected. If the casket bearers all come from the same household, I don't see that being an issue, but there are bylaw officers, of course, and the cemetery may have issue with them not being protected, even if they're living in the same residence. So We just want to avoid any issues with the local authorities if at all possible.
That's the last thing you want interrupting a ceremony.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, we've had people that have, there's these whistleblower call lines that people can call into. And if they're in the cemetery or they're walking through the cemetery, they see a group of individuals carrying a casket and they report that to the authorities. So we're just trying to avoid any negative experience that could come back on the family. We actually, in Calgary here, we have a company that we use to act as casket bearers. The family can stay in their vehicles or stay at a distance and still watch as the casket bearers carry. They're all work together. They all have the necessary equipment. They'll carry the casket, and then once it's placed on the grave, then they will leave, and then the family can gather closer to the grave. So there's all kinds of ways around it. You just have to be aware of what the rules are in your particular area, and obviously the funeral director is aware of that, and they're going to try to be cognizant of those things.
Here's a lovely a comment from Paula Gale, who I think is in Newfoundland. She says, church family and community members sat in their vehicles outside the cemetery to be present while the service was happening. The funeral director also processed the deceased through the town and past his home and a church and slowed out front of each as a sign of remembrance and respect. What a great idea. I love that. Yeah,
there's lots of great things going on. I saw another situation where the family had lost their loved one. Friends had organized a drive by the family's residence, and they would drive. The family was gathered out on the driveway, and you've seen this probably on TV with birthdays, but it was done for a loss of a loved one. And as they drove by, a person would get out and place a rose on the driveway, and then drive off, and the next car would pull up and place a rose, and there was a long procession that did that. So there's lots of really great ideas out there, and I guess the sky's the limit on the creativity, but we got to do everything we can to help folks out in this difficult time, obviously. Well, and it's one thing to be creative, it's another thing to borrow somebody else's great idea. Yep. So it's much easier to share the ideas here, and then when we get the phone call at after this is over and somebody says, I need to plan a funeral, we've got a few ideas in our back pocket. So I think that's part of why it's helpful to share these here. I'm seeing Jane talking about how she attended a funeral via live stream with one of those who were killed in Nova Scotia. It was just private for the family there, but then live streamed for everybody else. And they used all kinds of photos and symbols and things. Yeah, something else I've seen done too is instead of a live streaming funeral, and I'm not even sure how you would classify it or describe it, but basically each individual that was involved in the service recorded their own segment of the service, and then it was all put together into like almost a movie, I guess is the best way to describe it. So for example, the clergy would do their welcome, they would do their message, any other components of the service, record it, send it to the funeral home. Then whoever did the recorded music or live music, whatever, would record that from their house and send it to the funeral home. Another person do the eulogy and so on. Then it was done in a recording and put on the funeral home's website so people could just log on at any time. So it was almost like making a movie. It wasn't live, but it was just done in segments by each individual and compiled into one ceremony that could be viewed at any time. Who knew when we all went to seminary that we were going to need video editing skills? Well, funerals today are pretty skillful in that area, so check with your local provider. They can probably help you out in that regard. Yeah. There's another thought from Kathy of a funeral where people in the town stood outside in their driveway with signs of condolence and of love and respect for the deceased. It puts a new spin on the whole funeral procession, right? I mean, you might plan a route very differently for a funeral procession if you knew people were going to be waiting in their driveway for you to drive by. Mm-hmm. Bill and Susan, you've been remarkably polite and very quiet. Have you got any questions or thoughts, suggestions to add into this conversation with Rhett or folks online here? What kinds of things would you want to ask your local funeral director about? Suggestions and ideas for help before we kind of pivot our programming a little bit here.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the changing regulations because Brett was mentioning that that sometimes you can have the funeral home with groups of people coming and going, or that people can come in, you know, stay and then leave, and others can come, or even at the cemetery having groups. And I keep talking to colleagues who have stories about, depending on where people are and how a bylaw officer has interpreted it. I heard a story the other day of a bylaw officer waiting until a service was over and going into the funeral home and giving tickets to everyone in the building. Mm. So I guess what I'm wondering is how do we know day to day what's changing? Because it seems like even where the regulations are in place, there's different interpretations being made of those regulations depending on who it is that is doing the enforcement. So is it mostly safe just to be very cautious about having anything more than in Ontario 10 people?
Yeah, I think the safest thing that I've found is to schedule 3 separate events for the same person. So it's not a continuous come and go. And you can also do up invitations or almost like tickets, I guess, passes to give to people that have been invited to come. So the family would have to figure out who would be coming to the first session. And then the funeral home could send like an invitation of some form or another, and the people as they come would have to produce that. For the most part, they're going to know who's allowed and who isn't going to be allowed because it would be by invite only. As long as they kept the number under 15, you have an hour or two of gathering, and then the next group would come in an hour or 2 hours later so that the funeral home would have time to kind of disinfect and clean a little bit before the next group would come in. So I wouldn't have like a lineup outside of people coming in and out. I would just have this group at this time and then another group at another time and so on. You have a little more control over who's coming in and out.
That's helpful.
That's a lot of extra work for your staff to disinfect after each one.
Oh, it is, absolutely. And also, if you're doing multiple funerals, it becomes a real challenge because you could have several in a day. So we got to be careful what we promise families because we may not necessarily be able to fulfill that depending on how many other folks that we're needing to care for at that time.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Stephen, to Brett, because I'm sort of on the fringe. I work a lot with funeral directors in the funeral industry, although I'm a grief counselor. But I think we really need to say today that I think funeral directors are really on the front line with all of this. And I know many of them personally, and believe me, this has been a huge, huge task, a lot of risk, all kinds of things that these folks are doing. And I think all of us really just need to ask Brett to commend to all of his colleagues, just everybody who's just really, they're putting, you know, they're in a situation where this job could kill me. And you know, that's a very serious thing. I also, if I could just also say that what I hear us talking about in all of these great ideas and all of these great things, I agree, things change day to day. But what we're talking about here is ritual. So whether it's having 9 people in the church or in the funeral home or at the cemetery or outside it, it's all ritual. And someone once defined ritual as a ritual is something you do when you don't know what to do. I hear in all of these things is Brett telling us so, and thank you very much, Brett. It's been extremely insightful. But I hear him saying, you know, that people want to do something. Mm-hmm. What do they want to do? Anything. Because, you know, we're trying to find meaning in a situation that doesn't make a lot of sense when anybody dies, but even less sense in this kind of situation. And I would like to ask Brett a question, and it would simply be, in what ways do you feel the COVID-19 has changed the funeral industry, and how do you see that progressing as things get back to what some people are calling normal? Do you see people changing the way that they're doing funerals?
Well, it's hard to say at this point because until these restrictions are lifted, it's hard to say how things are going to change. I really do believe, though, that we're social beings. We need to have that physical and emotional support when we lose someone we love, and I don't see that changing. People really want to get together. They realize they can't be close. They have to keep their distance, but they can still offer that emotional support in other ways. So, you know, once this is over, I think things will probably go back to similar what they were before, except some of these creative things that have been done in the last month or two are maybe going to be a little more common. You know, like the video live streaming of funerals, that's something that's been available for years. You know, as you know, people live all over the world nowadays, and they can't necessarily come home to a friend or loved one's funeral. So the alternative is to watch that online. And so that's something that's been available for years. And obviously in this environment, it's become very popular, and it probably will stay that way. People will be more aware of it that maybe weren't so in the past, but I don't see things changing too much.
I actually am. I'm actually quite encouraged because, you know, we've gone through a few years, you know, where people, oh, we're not going to have a funeral and we're not going to have anything, and just you know, leave me at the curbside on Monday morning, that kind of thing. You know, there's an old saying that you don't know what you've got till it's gone, and I actually see a real opportunity for us to actually come back with ritual, to sort of say, yes, we do need the social support. We do need the grief support. We do need all of these things. And I'm actually encouraged to think, well, you know what, maybe that people will realize what they've missed.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this has really made people reevaluate life and what's important. Like, you know, you look at what's going on in nursing homes right now. You've got folks that can't go visit their parents because of the risk, and you know, it's really changed, I think, how people look at how they interact with their loved ones and their families. And yeah, I totally agree with you, absolutely.
And some of them hadn't been there for months anyway, but now that they can't go, they're you know, so maybe we'll learn something out of all this. We can only hope.
Oh yeah, I totally agree.
So somebody in the chat is saying that she's steeling herself for a whole slew of celebrations once the social restrictions are lifted. I know I am too. I can't imagine how you're planning for that, Brett. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, once the restrictions are lifted, yeah, absolutely. I think we'll see a lot more funerals. We'll be busy, but that's okay. That's what we do. We'll make it work. We're here to serve those in need, and we'll do what we can to meet those needs.
Somebody was asking about food and receptions, and that's been a big part of every funeral I've ever been part of. And I imagine you're doing none of that right now. Is that true?
Yeah, we're not at our business, and a lot of our funerals across the country are in the same boat. The risk is just too high because you've got people handling food and so on. So they really strongly discourage that right now. So again, a lot of families are choosing to delay things until they can actually have a gathering and they can have the reception and that type of thing. So yeah, there's not an easy way around that, other than what I indicated earlier about, you know, friends can send food packages to the family's house, that type of thing. You know, especially older folks, they don't want to go out because they're high risk. That's a good opportunity to meet their needs, is have food delivered to their home.
So let me shift our conversation just a little bit and turn a little more to Bill and to Susan. There seems to be this strong sense that we should just put this all off until we can get together. But that could be a year away. We're not going to get back together in our churches anytime real soon, I don't think. What do you think of this idea of let's just put it on hold?
Well, for my experience in a congregation, that's exactly what's happening. And I had a couple of memorial services that were going to be fairly large that were planned just before the closing down of churches, which have been put on hold indefinitely. And since then, several deaths in the congregation or related to the congregation. And again, people have immediately said, we're just going to wait. And that seems to be the normal response. I guess I'm not sure, along with whoever suggested that there was going to be, we would be busy in the fall. I had a similar conversation today with someone about just not only delayed funerals, but delayed weddings, and just what that's going to mean for all of us in the fall or later. I guess my thought is that in some cases, the delay will turn into just nothing happening. And that worries me more than a delay that does finally get dealt with. Because if people delay and then do nothing, then they really haven't had closure and they really haven't dealt with the grief.
Yeah.
I think
You've
that's
been a grief counselor for so long. What's your recommendation to folks in this kind of situation? How do we help the grief not get stalled?
Well, I don't think it has to be either or. I've conducted a few funerals in the last month or so where they've had 9 people there and or it's just been at the cemetery and a committal or something of that nature. And then later on, a celebration of life. I think I've conducted celebrations of life a year after the death for people who said, no, we don't want to do anything. We're fine. We're okay. And it's later on that they feel they want to do something because, you know, they want to honor the death. They want to remember the life. So I don't think if it's 3 months from now or 6 months from now or a year from now, sometimes people are better able to celebrate a life a little bit down the road. I don't think necessarily that the ritual is connected with the complicated grief. One of the questions I'm asked all the time is, does this mean that people's grief is going to be complicated? Complicated grief isn't caused by a situation. Complicated grief is caused by people's reaction. And I think that often what we need to do is to encourage, and I think where clergy can help, and grief counselors and funeral directors can help, is by giving them the resources to try to work through some of the emotions, you know, and to understand the process, to understand what they're going through. Because I think for the first 3 months after a death, most people are numb and they're in shock. Now, there's no time frame to grief, but generally speaking, you know, for the first little while, people are numb, and it's maybe say 3 months down the road or even 6 months down the road, all of a sudden, oh my goodness, this has happened. They're gone. And that can sometimes be the time when we can offer the support and so on. So again, there are online grief support programs at the moment. There are all kinds of different resources that can be offered to people to say, well, you know, even though this wasn't exactly as you would have liked it, I think that's what it boils down to. This is not what we would have wanted for our loved one.
I guess, Bill, one of the things that I agree that complications can get dealt with and that clergy have a role to play in that. But I guess I am seeing that there is a further development, I guess, around the COVID-19 experience. And what I'm seeing from folks who are calling me who are dealing with grief now is that it is it's more extreme, it's more intense, it seems. And for a couple of reasons, I think. One is that people are feeling more isolated, and so there's an intensity to that bereavement that perhaps wasn't there before, either because they were distracted with a lot of other things or they had other outlets. But secondly, I'm sensing too that where there has been an unresolved relationship, and they were then not able to have any opportunity for any kind of reconciliation of that relationship before it ended, that there is just intense pain that people are experiencing.
Well, now we're going to use up the rest of the hour because these are some fabulous, these are exactly right points. Because again, to put it briefly, people say, what's the worst kind of loss? Is it worse to lose someone suddenly, or is it worse to lose someone after a long lingering illness? Every loss is difficult, but every loss is different. And the difference between a sudden death or an unanticipated death, and a death that, you know, where someone's been ill for years, someone who has had cancer for, say, 3 years, for example, people prepare themselves for the death before the death. In a sudden, unexpected death, and in a situation like this, people have to prepare themselves for the death after the death. And that's often what complicates it. One of the 7 factors in complicated grief is an unresolved relationship. So and that can be aggressive, abusive, or it can be ambivalent. I think, however, that you've touched on a very, very important point. And I mentioned it at the very beginning because I think what has made this so complicated in the last 3 months or whatever the time frame here is, there have been so many losses. It's been one loss on top of the other. So people aren't just dealing with the death. They've been dealing with the illness. They've been dealing with the death. They've been dealing with the isolation. There's no family to lean on for support. There's no friends around. Plus, I think all of us have really been forced to face our own mortality in the last 3 months. I could go to the grocery store and catch this and be dead in 14 days.
Yes.
And I think that it's, I mean, while, you know, we all realize our mortality and all the rest of it, but I think in a very real way, the layers of losses that people have experienced that's what's really complicated the grief process. So that was a great point, Susan. I appreciate it.
I think that's important, and it underlines for me the value of more than one ritual or more than one ceremony. That I fully understand why people are saying we need to do something significant when we can all be in the same room together. But I also think that there's value in doing something now, even if it's not the only thing we do. I hosted a memorial last Tuesday night for somebody in my congregation. We had most of them on Zoom, a few of them on the telephone, and I really just put the bookends on it. I opened it with prayer, I closed it with prayer, and then they told stories for an hour and a half. And at the end of it all, they told me 2 things that I thought were really helpful. They first of all said, "This was so great. I'm so glad we did this. I feel so much better. We've got to do this for real when we can." And so for some, it was both and, right? It wasn't enough, but it was a whole lot better than nothing. And I wonder whether it's okay to be offering that as an option to families and say, you know, it won't be perfect, but we can do something that will be respectful and allow for some closure and plan for the future gathering at the same time.
I think I hear something though here that I think I just want to make a quick point. Sorry, Brad, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. But I hear the thing is, it's the family's agenda.
Mm-hmm.
I think our responsibility is to show the families the options that they have. So you can have something now, you can have something later, you can have both. You can meet outside I mean, I couldn't help but thinking, here's people lining up outside the hospital or lining up outside the home or gathering at the cemetery. That's a ritual, and it's doing something, and it's giving people, I think, the option. You know, I really think that's our purpose, is to give them the different options and to ask what would be meaningful for them. Because what you described, I thought that was the real thing.
I thought it was too.
Yeah,
I was astonished when we came to the end of it and they said it wasn't. And that's fine. I mean, I will gladly drink tea with them in a year, but it was interesting. The emotional reaction was, it was important and it wasn't enough.
I have some folks that want to do the real thing later on and are putting it on hold, but are having conversations about just doing the cemetery part of the service. And I did a cemetery service yesterday. First of all, our cemeteries in Barrie, our cemeteries in lockdown. So you have to have someone meets you at the gate, and the gates are across, and you have to state where you're going and who you're with and to get in. And then there's monitoring to make sure that there's distance being observed. Wow. So when I got there yesterday, they just had 8 or 9 folks there. and they were observing the social distance. But I must say it made the whole ceremony very formal, in a sense that people were not touching, were not able to get close to each other, and so it created a more solemn, I guess, kind of gathering than you normally would have, where folks would give somebody a hug that they hadn't seen for a few weeks or months, and people would sort of chat a bit before they gathered around the gravesite, et cetera, et cetera. People just sort of stood and were very silent and solemn. So I left wondering if perhaps we hadn't achieved as much as we had hoped with even having the graveside service. And of course, when it was over, they were told that they would have to leave fairly soon, and they would not be allowed to come back in later because the cemeteries closed down.
I've wondered about this as we've been talking about these highly managed graveside ceremonies, because it seems to me, I mean, yes, we want to be respectful to the deceased, and we need to do something respectful with the remains. But a big part of what a funeral's for is not for the deceased at all, it's for everybody else. And if we're setting up a ritual that only takes care of the logistical things for the deceased, it's not doing its job, I don't think. We need to be finding ways for people to give condolences and share memories and tell stories and do all the human stuff that the rest of us left behind need to do to make it feel real, and then start on the grief journey.
In our case, and I guess in most cases where there is a casket, you're required to have the burial. You're not being allowed to delay that. So if it's cremation, you can delay everything, but the graveside services have to happen with or without, I guess with or without the family, but the funeral home told me that they're not being allowed to delay those.
It's also an issue of handling the remains. If we have several families wanting to delay, we just don't have the space to keep everybody, unfortunately. So that's the other issue. So what you're seeing now is, I've heard it referred to as micro funerals. So you'll have just the family gather. It could be a graveside visitation, whatever the case may be. And then they plan for the ceremony where the public's involved at a later date. And something that was mentioned a little bit earlier that I wanted to comment on too was, I think the planning of the funeral is also therapeutic as well. Even though they might be delaying it until the fall or whenever the case might be that we're allowed to gather, they've got a lot of time to plan it, and that whole process can be therapeutic as well.
I was wondering about that, Brett. I mean, I always do that in person. I can't imagine trying to offer an authentic funeral if I only connect with people or one person by telephone. Can we come to the funeral home and have a meeting with 5 of the family members in one of your big reception rooms and all sit 10 feet apart? Would that be acceptable to the funeral home?
Yeah, I would check with the funeral home, as I can't speak for everybody across the country, but I know for my business, that's certainly not a problem. We've got large rooms in the funeral home that we can set up to accommodate that. And a lot of times that's how we meet with the family when they come in. We just put a little restrictions on how many can come in. We don't want, 20 people showing up, but
it would have to be by invitation, and it would have to follow all the standard rules. And
exactly. Yeah, and we give them the option to either come in to physically meet with us. We can do it over the phone. We can do it through email. We can do much the same format we're doing today. We've made arrangements with families in this layout, so they can see us, we can see them, we can show them our screen so they can see different options that are available to them. So there's lots of different scenarios that can be played out to meet their needs.
Bill, I think that's a real time to start the grief counseling. What kinds of things do you think clergy need to do apart from just figuring out the logistics of the ceremony?
I think that there's a school of thought that says that a good funeral is the beginning of a good grief process. And I agree with that. However, I think that there's also a process that is necessary. Most funeral homes offer on their websites or through some of the resources, the brochures and booklets and all this kind of stuff. And I think that often understanding grief has to begin with just that, understanding. Because we live in a culture, we call it a death-denying culture, and we all know that. It's a loss-denying culture. And I think one of the things that I wanted to mention ties right into your question, and it's this, that even now, you know, we're seeing a lot of, it's sometimes I call it toxic positivity, because it's all going to be okay, you know, everything's going to come together and everything's going to be fine. And I think for those who have not been touched by that, we've all been touched by this. For those who haven't been touched directly, that's fine to look on the bright side and so on. But I think people need to go through and say, you know, for many people, everybody's experience has been different. Some people have kind of sailed through it, and, you know, the social distancing has been difficult, but hey, you know, it's been able to stay home and da-da-da. For other people, frankly, it's been a living hell. People who've lost their jobs, people who are out of work, people who've seen their life savings just disappear. So many losses, so many situations. And I think it's very important that we understand that, yeah, it's not just a matter of looking on the bright side. We've got to say, I've had a loss. Our world has been turned upside down. You were asking me the other day about the theories of grief and the phases and the stages and stuff like this. And these are all very helpful. But I think the only way we can really understand what a person experiences in bereavement is to understand that their whole world has been turned upside down. And for some people, that's exactly it. So it's going to take a lot of working through. I wasn't able to go and see my mom, my dad in the nursing home in the last month of their life when they were struggling. That's complicated. They're going to have to talk that through. But the first thing they have to understand is they have every right to grieve. Because grief isn't some kind of a mental health disorder. Grief is actually a natural human reaction to any loss.
Do you think people don't feel that now?
I think they feel it. I'm just not sure that they feel able to express it.
Okay, that's what I meant. They don't.
In other words, sometimes people's, oh, well, you know, it's all for the best. And sometimes with great respect, you know, well, it's God's will, or bringing the Almighty into it. I think sometimes that does not give them permission to grieve. And that's all I'm really saying. We need to create an environment where we say, yeah, this has been tough. And yeah, it wasn't perfect. And we've every right to protest that. Because grief is actually a protest against something that we didn't like, we didn't want, and worst of all, something we can't change. So the first thing we have to do is to help people to understand, you know, this reaction that we're having, why people are feeling depressed, why we're angry and anxious, and all of these emotions that come out. And then once we understand it, to be able to express it and so on. And I think that can be done with friends and family and so on. I don't think it necessarily has to just be, you know, professional counselors. I think clergy can play a vitally important part in doing that with some of the things that they do in the church. Groups can be set up, and people who can come together, who've been through the experience, to talk about it, you know. And I think community self-help groups are a vitally important part of how we'll be able to put things back together again in the months and maybe even the years to come, depending on what happens.
Sounds like when we're meeting with the family, it would be helpful to listen and encourage people to talk about all the other losses they're experiencing at the same time, and be a little more explicit about how those are layering on top of each other right now.
Let me just clarify what are you talking about, when they're planning a funeral or afterwards?
Either or. I mean, I think most of us have ongoing relationships with folks in grief, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think at the time of the funeral, they're focused on dealing with the funeral. You know, I mean, that's overwhelming enough by itself. But I think as pastoral care continues, you know, then to sort of understand, I call them primary and secondary losses. So somebody dies, but as a result, there are so many other losses, or if COVID-19 is the loss, the dominoes that have fallen over as a result of the disease, and helping people understand all the things that we've lost in our culture and families and the workplace and the community, I think is very important.
I guess, Bill, I've had both experiences. I've had people who the primary focus is the loss or the bereavement, and they get very, very busy with planning the funeral and dealing with all the logistics of it. But I can think of many, many times when I've gone to meet with a family about planning a funeral, and all of a sudden we're talking about something else altogether. And the first time it happened, it kind of threw me off because I was not prepared for it. I was set to work with them on organizing the funeral.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we were into talking about a loss. It was one parent and we were talking about the loss of the other parent, or we were talking about a loss of a job, or we were talking about a dysfunction in the family that had gone back, years, and there was real bitterness and acrimony there. So I guess I've had both experiences, and I guess I've come to a point of just knowing I need to sit there and listen, and then pick up the pieces and figure out where we're going with this conversation.
The question becomes why. If you understand the why, the how takes care of itself. And I think in some ways, talking about other losses and something that happened years ago or whatever, I can only think of the word denial. I don't really want to use denial, but in a sense, it's easier to talk about these things than it is to focus in on the actual thing. So understanding why the people are discussing this rather than that can sometimes be insightful.
Yeah, I guess in some cases, it seems to me it's some unresolved things that have never been dealt with, and suddenly people have permission, or giving themselves permission, to now finally deal with that grief.
That's exactly right. Because I don't believe in losses. I just believe in loss. And today's death sometimes triggers a reaction to yesterday's loss. And sometimes we need to sort that out and to say, okay, so because otherwise it gets to become like a tangled ball of string. And how do we sort of just get the threads and separate them all and deal with this situation and that situation? Otherwise, it's always just a real conglomeration.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very good point.
So let's talk theologically for a few minutes, because so far a lot of what we've talked about is psychological. It's about the how we as celebrants can help people deal with this experience of having their life turned upside down, and I think that's really important. And I think for some people who come to us, it's all they want. I've done lots of funerals for folks who said, don't want anything religious, or, you can say a prayer, but this wasn't a religious person, so don't do anything else. And so, all of the things that we've been talking about here, I think, fit into that. But for those of our parishioners who are steeped in the Christian traditions and are looking for some assistance out of our Christian theology, where do we go with that, and how do we add that to everything else we've been saying?
Oh, is that one directed at me?
I hope so.
Either one. You're both clergy. And you both do funerals, and then because I asked it, I don't have to answer it myself.
Well, even as you're raising that, I'm thinking, United Church clergy are the ones who are known to do the funerals for everyone, and
Sure.
that funeral homes often are calling on United Church people because they know that we have a certain flexibility theologically, I guess, or a willingness to deal with the person and the situation, in front of any kind of laid on theology. So I guess when I think of funerals that I've done over the years, probably half of them have been folks who would give that very phrase, I want something spiritual but not religious.
And what do you think they mean by that?
Well, I guess for me, when someone says they want something spiritual, not religious, I'm thinking that they don't want the institutional morality coming down on them. They don't want the heavy guilt that they assume is going to be part of a religious service. And the more unchurched they are, or the more on the margins of that, the more they have preconceived ideas about what the institutional church is going to offer them. And so I think part of our role is to, again, work with them around what their expectations are, or how they're interpreting what that laid on package is going to be, and help them see the broader possibilities of a true celebration of life, and allowing the grieving process to happen.
I think that's an issue that lots of folks on the who are watching are thinking about all the time too with funerals. How do you respond when somebody says, I want something that's spiritual but not religious? Put your thoughts in the chat there, and we'll kind of work with that a little bit. And while they're typing, Bill, how do you respond to that question? I'm sure you hear that a lot too.
I'm sorry, was that for me?
Yeah, I was saying, Bill, while
Yes,
they're typing, if they want to add something,
Sure.
you see that a lot too. What do you think they're looking for when they say that?
I think Susan described very well exactly what people mean by it when she said, they've gone to a service where, someone thumps the pulpit and really gives the whole double barrel blast of preaching the gospel or whatever. I believe in the gospel, and I believe that we serve a God of comfort. And so I think it's important that we bring spiritual perspective and comfort and so on. But again, I start off my interviews for funeral services by saying, now look, I want you to know this isn't my agenda. This is your agenda. Oh, the relief. Oh, that's great. Oh, we're so glad to hear it. It's our agenda. Okay, what should we do? And then I'm able, by asking them questions, to find out what they would like. Scripture readings. Oh, yes, that would be fine. And prayers. Yes, that would be fine. And then to offer some kind of hope. And these kind of things. There's a verse in Thessalonians that talks about, we weep not as others who have no hope. And some people think that means we weep not as others who have no hope. But actually, it's not a theological issue. It's a punctuation issue. In the Greek, it actually says, Brett, trust me, these guys are going to go look this up. Believe me. But in the Greek, it says, we weep, comma, not as others who have no hope. But I sometimes go to Hebrews chapter 11. And in that chapter where they talk about the list of the heroes of the faith, by faith, Moses, by faith. And there's a little verse in there that says, by faith, Abel, who was one of the sons of Adam and Eve, by faith, Abel, though dead, still speaks. Now, what does that mean? Is he coming through Shirley MacLaine or something like that? No, that's not what it means at all. It means that his life was such that it still speaks to people, his example and so on. And I sometimes take a verse like that and I apply it and I say, and this applies, and people relate to that, and you've obviously you choose carefully or you choose wisely who you're speaking about, but there's all kinds of ways that we can come at it without necessarily, appearing religious. And then people have found it meaningful, and that's really what they're looking for. They want it to be meaningful. They want their loved one to be remembered. They want the death to be honored and the life to be remembered. And that's really what they're looking for.
I think those are important. And let me say that again, they want meaning. They want their loved one to be remembered. They want to be told, I think, that they were worth it, that they were cared for, that they made a difference. Beyond that, you said something about hope. What do we hope in? And what do they hope in? And how do we share the hope we feel with them in a way that isn't prescriptive, but which is maybe life-giving?
Well, for some people, hope is that they hold on to the hope that they'll see their loved one again. For others, it's just hope that I can get through this week until tomorrow. But there are so many ways in which we can give hope. I mean, one of my favorite scripture passages, I use it as a theology of grief ministry, is the story of Jesus on the Emmaus Road. And if you follow the passage, very familiar passage, he meets up with these two disciples going along the road to Emmaus, and he talks to them, and he gives them an insight into what the Messiah was supposed to do. And at the end of the journey, they still don't get it. And then he goes into their home and he breaks bread. And the breaking of the bread, their eyes are opened and they see him and they rush back to Jerusalem. Audit version. So what changes from the sad and downcast people on the Emmaus Road at the beginning of the story to the two who go back and say, we've seen the Lord and he's resurrected? The fact is, nothing changes except them. The circumstances don't change. It's their perception of the circumstances that change. And I think sometimes it's giving people the hope to see that there's another way of looking at this. And I'm probably not the best one to be talking on about this. I'm sure Susan can add a great deal more than I can. But to me, I think it's very important to have people leave that service inspired and encouraged, and that it's been a positive experience for them.
Yeah, I think people are looking for hope, and I think they're looking for comfort. I think too that they're wanting to make sure that the person that they love has been honored in some way.
Right.
That there's some kind of legacy that's being held up, that there's some kind of ongoing meaning to their life. And I think that also, to come back to the religious service, I think they're nervous that it won't just be a service where there's just a laid on ritual, and that there won't be an actual honoring of the person. One of the services that I've done that I just thoroughly enjoyed was a service for someone where we had a Buddhist monk that was doing the bowl ringing. We had a group of drummers who presented a drumming circle at the front of the church. We had scriptures read. We had people who talked about the many different facets of that person's life. And it was just this amazing coming together of a whole bunch of different spiritual threads that, when it was done, just gave people such a, people were just so moved by it. And as it got being put together, I sort of wondered how all these pieces were going to be coming together. And yet when it was finished, people were just remarkably moved. And it created this cohesion, bringing all these different parts of his life together. And my sense was we had truly honored the legacy of that person in our midst and in our community.
Some of the Scottish funerals I do even have bagpipes.
Yep, I've seen lots of bagpipes at funerals too.
That's spiritual.
Yeah.
It's
I
something.
think that can exercise in social distancing, Bill.
That wasn't very ecumenical, Stephen.
Oh, my Scottish forebears would be unhappy with me. So somebody in the chat was talking about whether there's a difference between a celebration of a life and a funeral. We're seeing more and more requests for celebration of life these days. Are they the same thing? Are they different? What are we talking about there?
I get requests for funerals, memorial services, and celebration of life. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't see a lot of difference. It's how they are, the door they're walking through in terms of how they're approaching it. I'd like to hear from folks on the chat. And by the way, can I just say a shout out to all the folks that I've seen a number of names coming up as people were coming on the call, folks I haven't seen for some time. So I just want to say hello to my colleagues out there.
Isn't it fun to see all these names?
Yeah, it is. But I'd love to hear, if they're making a distinction there between those things, but they all kind of roll in together in a lot of ways for me.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think it's just how people, to me, it's just the words. It, you pretty much said it all.
If anything, I think it's the clue to the officiant about what kind of service people want. So if they say we don't want a funeral, we want a celebration of life, what they're saying is don't be a drudge.
My brother-in-law was Missouri Synod Lutheran. And when he died, there was a very formal ritualized service where there was no storytelling about his life. That all happened afterwards at the reception. And the pastor who led the service gave us a 20-minute sermon about how everybody who wasn't part of his religion was going to hell. And it was the most uncomfortable service I've ever been at. And if that's what people think funerals are, I understand why they're looking for a different name.
Mhm.
But I think that's why people like Brett and all of his colleagues, and even peripheral guys like myself in grief counseling and stuff, that's where we need to educate people. We need to let them know the values of a meaningful funeral. And I know the funeral industry does a great job in reaching out to that. It's like everything else. It's like buying insurance. You never want to buy it until you need it, and then you can't get it. And so I say these guys have a hard job. They really do. Stephen, I don't mean to change the agenda, but I'm wondering if there are people, because it's taking me, my limited technology, it's taking me all my time just to keep up with the four of you. I'm wondering if there's any questions that are coming in directly to Brett or to Susan or to myself that we could address.
There have been some, and I've tried to kind of pull them back into the conversation, which is really helpful. If there are specific questions, though, we've got about 10 minutes left in our covenanted time together. We can always end early, but we can go for another 10 or 12 minutes. And if there are specific questions, I would love to kind of open that up completely. There's been some good discussion in the chat around celebrations of life, which is why I brought that in. There's been some discussion of various different hymns that people who are wanting, when they're not necessarily wanting a religious funeral, and yet they're wanting Amazing Grace and the Old Rugged Cross and things that maybe are theologically from a different era and yet somehow speak to people's souls, even when they don't want something formally religious. So there's been that kind of acknowledgement that there's a implicit spirituality, even memories of religion, in our society that people draw on, even if they're saying they don't want something religious.
I guess I have a bit of a theory about the Amazing Grace and how great thou art and Old Rugged Cross. Mm-hmm. And that is that often funerals end up being planned by relatives who are not particularly churched. Mm-hmm. And so they go with the name of a hymn that they seem to remember.
And then it's a minister solo when it comes around, right? Because nobody else in the congregation knows it either. Yep, been there, done that.
I have a slightly different interpretation. I think it triggers something deep within people. And I always see that as an invitation, an invitation to include something that's obviously touched them at some point and maybe has become dormant or disillusioned or whatever. And I kind of, I try to sort of find the opportunity in these kinds of things rather. And often it touches on something very important.
Yeah. Other questions? Oh yeah, in the marrow of your bones, says Betty Jean, like it's the Lord's Prayer. It's sort of built into us. And Chelsea says sometimes those hymns are also connections with others that the deceased person loved, or that their family loved, or sort of a memory of somebody who grew up in that generation. Certainly, I sing different hymns at funerals and long-term care homes than I do on Sunday morning, almost always. because the population's different.
Again, that talks to me about the importance of understanding people's agenda, what they want, what's meaningful for them, rather than me imposing my wishes or my suggestions on people. I think that's very important.
Sure. Are there other questions, issues that folks online who are participating in this have about, specifically about dealing with funerals and grief in the midst of the pandemic? We've kind of drifted into talking generally about funerals, which I think is valuable, and gosh, isn't it helpful to be able to talk shop among colleagues? But in our last few minutes together, maybe we should pivot back to this COVID stuff. Is there other stuff you're wondering about or experimenting with or concerned about that these folks might have a perspective on? We could pivot back to that if you like.
Could I
Michelle wants to know more about toxic positivity or hopium.
Toxic positivity. Well, it really, what you mean by that is that everybody wants to sort of look on the bright side and the good side, and you know, it's everything's going to be fine, and we tend to sort of brighten up the picture. But this is, people have to go through the valley before they, you know, come out the light at the other end of the tunnel. That's terrible cliches, but I think that's it. You know, we have to recognize this has been hard for a lot of people, very difficult for people, and allow them to go through the pain of that. You know, we try to make things painless. This hurts, and so that was the point I was going to make. Was I hope that many of the clergy who are listening would see the opportunity for some education following this, because I think people have gone, oh my goodness, what's going on here? What will we do? And I think there's some real opportunity for education and to think about some of the issues of life and death that'll come out of this.
Education in what sense? You mean we would do sort of after church study groups
through messages, through study groups or whatever? What did we learn? I mean, when after someone's been through a life-threatening illness and survived, I often say to them, what did you learn through all of this? And it's amazingly insightful discussion and conversation. I learned a great deal. I wrote a book based on some of the things that people told me on that, you know, because I think you just learn a great deal, and to give people the opportunity to express that and to vent that sometimes.
Well, and I've often thought that the time to do those kinds of education programs are in the regular study group times or in the regular sermons, not at a time of grief or a time of funeral.
Exactly right.
We need to be prepared for that when we're not so overcome with grief that we can't think straight.
I guess if there's anything that I've kind of heard from a number of folks, and it's not just necessarily around folks who are grieving right now, but it's this renewed sense of the fragility of life.
That's right.
Yeah. And that conversation seems to come up a lot now with people, and it seems to be affecting the whole outlook on life in terms of recognizing that life is precious, but also that we're maybe not as much in control of it as we have deluded ourselves into believing. And I think it's going to give us a fresher outlook as people look at what's important to them, and particularly that relationships are critically important.
Very wise words. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think that clergy and funeral directors are the two professions in our society where people are comfortable talking about death. I don't think there's any other profession where people are, maybe palliative care doctors or nurses, but almost nobody else is comfortable raising these issues without getting anxious and the terrible pit in your stomach. Remember, Rob Oliphant is an MP, and he was leading the committee that wrote the legislation around medical assistance in dying. He did a workshop with me online, and he said that he was astonished and moved by the number of his MP colleagues who would come to him for guidance because he is an ordained United Church minister. And he found that they couldn't talk about these issues in the ways that he could. But we swim in these waters, and we can be helpful to everyone else around us because we have thought about them a little more deeply and have a little more comfort dealing with the stuff that nobody can make sense of, I guess. It's not that we have all the answers, it's just that we're used to talking about it a little more. Yeah, Janice is talking about the Death Cafe, same kind of thing, right? It's a place where you can actually talk and know that the people who are listening aren't going to curl up into a ball.
But maybe one of the things that'll come out of this is that it won't just be clergy and funeral directors and grief counselors or professionals. It'll be people who talk to one another, because I've found that once you create an environment in which people feel able to talk and feel that they're going to be listened to, you know, they'll talk to one another. And I think that's something I'm hoping will come out of this as well.
We are coming close to the end of our time. A couple of times people have asked me about resources and ideas, particularly around dealing with grief in the middle of COVID-19. And just by chance, we've assembled a few of those. And I'm going to put links to them on the landing page with the recording. So let me just go and pull up the link for that so you can find it now. Oh, I thought I had it here and I don't, darn. I'll find that for you in a second. But the recording of this event will be available at United in Learning within about 5 minutes after we're finished. And a bunch of resources that Susan and Bill and Brett have recommended will be there too. There's a link to Bill's program and the website where he does the grief counseling program. There's a link to all of the provincial regulations that Brett's association is assembling for us so that his colleagues and ours can find out what the rules are this week. There's a bunch of articles from the American affiliate of Brett's organization that are talking about grief and resources for celebrants in this time. Some wonderful poems that where the copyright is not mentioned. So I decided I couldn't put it on my website, but I can link to theirs. So if you're looking for those kinds of resources, they should be there in a couple of minutes, and I will go and make them live as soon as we're done. But there are people exploring these issues and looking for resources. I want to acknowledge this has been a deep and rich conversation, and to thank each of our panelists for the expertise you bring and the passion that you bring. It's not everybody who can talk for 90 minutes about death and still smile at the end of it. And what a remarkable conversation this has been. So thank you. Thank you for the work you do and for the insight that you've brought us today.
And thank you very much, Stephen, for setting this up, and to everybody who's participated. It's been a privilege for me to participate. I'm sure I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues, but I'm sure I do. And thank you very, very much for taking time with us. It's been a privilege.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been very valuable, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you today.
I love the fact that we can talk across our two different professions and sort of cross-fertilize each other, because we both are dealing with the same population in really important ways, and I'm grateful for the work that we're all doing. Here, there's my supervisor, Kate Rod, who's come on the screen. I don't know whether she's trying to hone in here before we say goodbye. Oh, I need to unmute her. Go ahead, Kate.
I just wanted, so Brett, you and I spoke on the phone, and I haven't met Bill, and Susan, longtime colleagues. So thank you all very much. This has been everything and more than we hoped. There were actually 20 people. I tend to look at the YouTube feed in case anybody has questions, and I found that the people who are on YouTube they don't necessarily want to participate in the chat and whatnot. They just want to be part of the webinar. And so for this whole time, there have been anywhere from 20 to 26 people watching on YouTube. So we had almost 130 people today, which and obviously, you know, people that are deeply involved in this work. So thank you for the three of you for making time at the last minute. And Brad, I can't even begin to think how busy your life is. And Susan, I know what pastoral ministry, I know a little bit about what pastoral ministry is, and doing it in such a strange way. So on behalf of the United Church, thank you so much. And always thank you to Steve, who not many people have the ability to mute their supervisor.
I try not to abuse it.
No, Steve is just a total treasure. So I'm delighted to work with him whenever I can. So anyway, thank you all for the three of you. It's been very, very appreciative.
Okay, so in a minute, I'll take our facilitators off into a private breakout room where we can just debrief a little bit.
Yeah.
Before we go, I wanted to say a word about next week. We are trying to put together a sense of how worship is changing and evolving during the pandemic. There are some churches that are worshiping daily. There are some churches that are not exactly worshiping at all, but sending out orders of service and full worship services by mail so that people can all read it simultaneously at the same time of day, but each in their own homes. There's a variety of different ways that are being created to worship together. And we wanted to gather some of the best ideas. So if you're aware of something, send me an email, let me know. We'd like to collect those ideas and do for worship what we've done today. Figure out what the options are so that we're not all recreating the wheel, but each of us has a chance to cross-fertilize the other thoughts. We're going to invite Susan Lukey, who is the editor of Gathering, to be one of our panelists. Not sure yet who the other panelists will be. My goodness, we're pulling webinars together more quickly than we've ever done. But that something will come together around that topic for next week. Building on that, I think, but I'm not sure yet, we're going to work with people at the Edge Ministry to talk about how our ideas of church generally are changing. And so that'll be the following week. And we're trying to figure out how much longer we need to keep doing these weekly webinars, and what's going to be useful to us as ministry colleagues as we move forward into May and June. If you've got other topics, concerns, needs, questions, suggestions about where we might go with this Thursday program, again, drop me an email. Love to connect with you that way. And in the meantime, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you for being a part of this, and we'll look forward to seeing you if you can join us again next week. Bye for now.